First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us to be here and to speak. And the Anishinaabe, whose territorial lands we're in, thank you for having us here. And my co-presenter, Bertha. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with an overview of our project. So if you just go to the next slide. So the crux of this presentation really is about approaches to linking inherent rights and species at risk with culturally important species. So it's a unique situation for Indigenous communities, particularly within treaties and non-treaty lands, to be able to establish protection for species of cultural importance. So we're just going to dig into that, and then this presentation is about 15 minutes, and then Bertha and I are going to co-present a case study example where these concepts are integrated. So we'll cover definitions, very briefly, definitions of species at risk, cultural keystone species, and Aboriginal traditional ecological knowledge studies. We'll look at how much is enough, how Indigenous communities are applying these concepts, what kind of resources are available to undertake these studies or processes, and a brief summary, and then a specific case study related to caribou. Next slide. So I'm not a lawyer, and I'm aware and understand the regulatory context that we work within and recent court decisions which have been exploring relationships and rights related to species of cultural importance. But so there's always a regulatory context that we're working within, and the inherent rights and interests of the people that live on the land. So briefly, species at risk are wildlife species that are disappearing, at risk of declines or extinctions, predominantly at regional scales, not necessarily specifically local populations. There's international conventions, there's conventions on migratory birds, United Nations Biodiversity Convention, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that provide contexts that are related to international migratory species. There's federal, where there's political designations. So I'm sure you're all aware that there's a lot of politics involved in whether a species is at risk or not and where it's at risk. And then there's the science that underpins that, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And there's also provincial designations. So without going too far into the regulatory context, we'll go to the next slide. Cultural keystone species. So cultural keystone species are species that are linked to important cultural practices. This can be, it's a term that was coined by Nancy Turner, who's actually a prophet in BC, but it comes from the ecology context where species are critical to functioning of an ecosystem. Cultural species are important to heritage. And if you think about, the way I think about them is, if you think about your children's children, if that species isn't there, will it matter? And in most of the contexts we're talking about, medicinal plants, berries, species that we harvest, that we eat, or species that are important to spiritual practices, all matter. And in some communities, they develop community-specific definitions of biodiversity that define that all species matter. So it's a question of how you identify the species of cultural importance to your community. Some examples are, for example, with the West Moberly in British Columbia, identified caribou as a very important cultural keystone species. And as caribou started to decline, they were no longer harvesting them, no longer practicing their right connected to caribou, no longer teaching their children some of the medicinal uses, some of the important practices. So a part of their heritage and culture was being lost. They were encaptured it in the title of the report, which they called, "I want to eat caribou again before I die." Very direct, very clear. There's also the cedar for the Haida. They went to court and defended the right to protect culturally significant cedar trees. So there's a number of different examples where communities have used cultural keystone species, particularly where linked to species at risk, for leverage in processes. So these can be defined by court or written by the communities. There's lots of different examples of the types of agreements. So this brings us to how we get at or define what are the culturally important keystone species. In Aboriginal traditional ecological knowledge studies, we use a number of different expertise. So I'm trained as an ecologist. I work with my community knowledge holders who are experts in the knowledge of the traditions in the land, and they know the land. And we also work with anthropologists to develop the proper research methodologies and protocols so that the science that we do is rigorous. The traditional knowledge studies stand up in these processes as solid. When you look at traditional knowledge studies, one of the differences between them and the way that scientists or government frame their studies is that often it's the scale that's different. So, for example, in the West Moberly court case, the right was recognized by the Supreme Court as to be held in the traditional territory. The province or the feds will look at caribou declines across the boreal or across the province or in large ecoregions. It doesn't help the community when those studies don't go down to a scale that's meaningful for a traditional territory. So the scale that we choose for our studies matters. And the presence of those animals or those species of cultural importance within the territory has been held up by court. The regulators will often say, well, it's okay if they decline in Constance Lake traditional territory because there's tons of them further north. So they're not actually even at risk there, so it's okay. But the community can identify traditional hunting areas, preferred hunting areas for preferred species in their territory. And it's very important information to put forward. And it's been held up in court. So designing your studies matters. Who helps you with your studies matters, especially if you have the right knowledge holders and the scale of your study. So we often take different types of approaches. We use ethno-historical studies, we use focus groups, we use semi-structured interviews. Sometimes we'll use elders meetings, community meetings. And then if there's money, it's hard to get the money for it, but if there's money, compiling the information and then taking it out onto the land, doing on-territory verification of your baseline. The Western science studies, Bertha will show you an example of this in her presentation, and you're probably all aware of this. They take one snapshot in time, like she just did of me. One snapshot is what you get, and that's, maybe they have radio color data from 2009 to 2011, or maybe they have 1 year of data, but they can't tell you where the caribou used to be, or what values on the land are required for those species to be present. That the knowledge holders can tell you very specific information about the habitat and the landscape close to where they practice their rights. And that information isn't available to the province or the feds or to the scientists. Or rarely is there collaboration to share that kind of information. The other thing that we can do is something that we're trying to undertake in our study. We haven't got the funding for it yet, but habitat modeling. Again, when the province does their work, they use best available information that they have. And it's usually they try to be quantitative, but they don't bring in the knowledge of the elders. And the elders will say, so for example, my example is bison in northern Alberta. When the water table drops down in the Athabasca Delta, a certain thistle grows, and the bison won't eat it. So they won't go there anymore. But the provincial data sets still show those areas as important potential habitat for the bison. So they say, well, there's lots of places for them to go. But the elders know that they won't go there anymore. And that's really important information to bring forward in the studies. Okay, how much is enough? So this brings us to the next question. How much is enough of your culturally important species? If you ask the province or the feds or the Western scientists, they'll say, well, we need enough for the species to exist. And they don't say where, and they don't say how many are there, and they certainly don't account for the practice of rights. So when we look at caribou action plans and management plans, you won't see a plan that talks about enough caribou being in your territory for you to go back and start hunting them again, or to sustain a good subsistence hunt for future generations. So the question you have to ask here, right, okay, so the questions you have to ask here are, in these rights-based harvest studies, so we call them rights-based harvest studies, but what it means is, how much did people used to harvest? How much should your child in the future have a right to harvest? How many caribou need to be there? Did they take 5 a year? How many moose? How much of your medicinal plants, how many berries? Not necessarily individual berries, but like, approximately kilos or something like that. But it's good to know how much needs to be there, because when you go back to these modeling exercises, you can then target. So you can say to the feds, sure, you guys can bring caribou back up north outside of our territory, but we still need enough caribou in Constance Lake territory for our hunters to go out and get 5 or 6 animals a year. So how do you do that? That's up to them, right? But you tell them this is what we need, or our rights are being infringed. So these are different ways that you can start to get at it. We do combine the knowledge that the scientists have. So we bring in everything that's available. And when we go and sit down with the elders and the knowledge holders, we have the traditional use of knowledge studies that have been done. We have the baseline data studies or radio collaring data. But inevitably in every project that we've done, it's the elders that really know where they used to be and where they go, and what is needed, what's required. Can you go to the next one? So how are people using this? So once you get your data, and once you have your study done, our practice in the communities that we've worked with has not been to share data. And I think you all will recognize the value of not sharing data. As soon as there's a space on a map that doesn't have data in it, it means something. The reality is it doesn't. It might mean we just don't know yet. So the data is very important internally. Oftentimes when we develop the maps or convey the information, we'll buffer and protect the data and abstract it. So you don't know where the point exactly is, or we generalize the points into groups of data. So Bertha will show you a few maps today that will show how in the end you could come up with a specific core habitat that's important without sharing the specific data. So environmental assessments, one example of that is the West Moberly case. And I know it's not in Ontario, it's in BC, but it is a very strong precedent. The West Moberly case was an environmental assessment process with first coal, and in the BC Supreme Court, the unanimous decision was to recognize the inherent right to preferred species collected with preferred means and in preferred areas. So this means the old argument that we call the rats and crows argument, where we say, well, caribou are gone, but you guys still have, whatever, muskrat or crows and rats. You still have something to eat, so your right's not infringed. That's no longer on the table, right? It is specific species. Rats and crows don't count. And it's preferred means and it's preferred areas. So it's important when you do these studies to identify where do people want to go. Because one of the things that happens frequently is that they'll say, yeah, sure, we're going to protect these species, but we're going to protect them over here. And it could be an area that's completely inaccessible. Say the cost of getting there for hunting is exorbitant, and nobody's going to go there. That, too, is no longer on the table. It has to be in preferred areas. So your preferred hunting areas are valid and credible and important. The other thing is that the Moberly case found that cumulative effects are relevant to these these assessments. So past wrongs, they call them past wrongs. You'll find, you probably experience this in processes where they'll say, well, I'm only reporting out on my project-specific impacts. So yes, all of your water is contaminated and there's a whole bunch of impacts on the landscape, but here's my project-specific impact. In the court case, the West Morbally case, they found that the past wrongs are relevant as part of your baseline. So it's important to consider those things. You can look at it as alienation to resources. So what places can you no longer get to? It makes the places that you can still get to even more important for access. So environmental assessment, planning processes. So Bertha's going to talk a bit about land use planning. Impact and benefit agreements and accommodation. So here's a great way to outline an impact to a practice or a right. If you have a good sense of what that practice is and where it is, and an industrial process comes in, you can document the preferred right, the preferred practice, the preferred species. You can also develop, like we were talking before, there's some nations that are developing their own definition of biodiversity that actually includes species that are already extirpated. So sometimes we don't talk about losses of species that are already gone, but those things are relevant when you look at a history of thousands of years on the landscape and projecting out the future for your children. The other opportunity here is reconciliation. So working with governments to identify opportunities for these rights and interests to be reflected in processes. How many people were in the mining session this morning? There's a lot of work to be done here. So this example here is a project that our research cooperative worked on with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. There was a provincial process combined with federal around the species at risk, identifying a plan for restoring species, and it didn't include important historical areas on their land. Partly, as I mentioned before, the province felt that because those herds were already declining, they were going to die anyway, so we shouldn't protect them. And the community was pushing back to say, no, actually, you need to protect them because our children have a right to hunt caribou in the future. And they won't be able to do that if you proceed with the plan that you have on the table. So they wrote up their own and went through their own process of putting that plan forward. And now it is used when industry comes into the community, they send this out to any referral and say, you have to meet these criterion for linear disturbances. It has to be less than our threshold. Has guidelines for management. So it tells industry what's acceptable practice and what's not. And it's available online. It's public domain. Next one. So what kind of resources are there? This kind of work is actually challenging to fund. There's a number of different places that you can get funding. One of them is through federal programs. So there's Aboriginal Fund for AFSAR, Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. They fund traditional ecological knowledge studies. There's provincial funds, so Ontario has a stewardship fund. There's a prevention stream for species. If you identify culturally important species that are in decline in your territory, you can get funding through their prevention stream. You can sometimes get funding through monitoring programs, through environmental impact assessments or IBAs. And sometimes you can get foundation funding, depending on the species and the agenda of the funders. So, looking at the opportunities, maybe go to the next one, next slide. Opportunities that are in this presentation, it's a nexus. And I think that one of the things that's important to recognize is that species at risk can also be used by the province to push back if there's places that you do want to develop. And I think that in order to be proactive and protect both areas that are critical to the future of cultural values on your landscape and to the future generations, it's an opportunity. It's just a tool among many tools. It allows for combining the rights-based approach and putting that forward into decision-making processes. And it's unique to Indigenous communities. Should we take questions before we go to your presentation? Maybe we can take some questions here before we go to the example, if anybody has any questions. Good. Oh, you're going.
Question. Question, Dave. Just something you said, scientific collection of data, methodology supports TEK. Shouldn't it be the other way around, that TEK supports scientific information supports TEK?
I mean, sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's completely wrong, right? Like if they radio color an animal and it wanders over into an area and it doesn't go somewhere else, it doesn't mean the other places aren't important.
I'm saying in the statement that that's what you said, that science is more relevant than TEK. TEK is just as relevant as science. That's all I'm saying.
Right. So I think that's a good point. And I think, no, actually thanks for raising that, because I think that one of the things that happens a lot is that Western scientists think that TEK is an add-on. And they contact communities and they say, hey, can you send us some TEK? Right? Does that happen? All the time. It's not an add-on. It's a knowledge system that is parallel to Western science and ecology. It's a separate knowledge system that needs the same amount of respect and the same amount of value going into processes as the Western science knowledge system.
So another point I wanted to make was that the information that you gather regarding migrating animals. Why we talk about thousands of years is because we followed the animals for generations and generations up and down Ontario. We went up here, came into Manitoba, they came back to Manitoba, back in Ontario. We followed these animals for hundreds of years. They put us in reservations in the last 60 years. So that the information is not being, historically there, that current information, we don't follow the animals anymore. Still behind.
It's interesting though, this knowledge is still there. I mean, when you sit down with the elders, they know where they went, and they remember those stories, and they were told about where the caribou were. So, that information is there. But you're right, it's changing, for sure. And it's changing, and it's important for us to get to document it and to get those stories from the elders and to do the interviews, and it gets lost. Thank you.
Okay, so when we applied for funding, when I first applied, I wasn't too sure if we were going to get it, so I was surprised that we got the approval. So that's why we wanted to. It's kind of hard for when you want to do species at risk. I know there's a lot of species at risk, depending on the plants or the animals. So we kind of concentrated on the caribou, because I know in the past the elders have talked about the caribou. We had caribou in our community within the surrounding area, and we wanted to find out exactly what happened, I guess. So that's why when the protection came into caribou, so we thought, okay, well, this might be a good opportunity to find out more information. So that's why we ended up putting in a proposal and finding out exactly, learning from our elders and learning from people who traveled the area. So that's why we went ahead and put in our submission. Okay, so now we have Carolyn is part of our group, because we have Firelight has on our other project on the land use planning, so they are part of our. There are consultants on our land use planning. So Carolyn came on board because we needed a biologist or some kind of technical science person. So that's how she came on board. Okay. Okay, so our objective was to do a baseline study and get the data from the elders, and so we wanted to use this as part of our land use plan, because that's one of our objectives, or one of our what do you call those things? Oh, subject items is species at risk. So that's why we put it into our land use plan. So we wanted to find out if there was any members that were still harvesting there. But the map I'm going to be showing you, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm going to be putting up a map, but the map is not going to be available on the presentation. It's just going to be a blank. But I will show you where our area is. You have that, Carolyn? Okay. So I will show you, and we're also looking at having a monitoring program. We wanted to go up maybe next in the spring to go look for tracks and find out exactly if they're still moving back and forth to within our area, or if they're going to another area. Like, we want to find out exactly where they are, or we want to at least know if there's a if they're present. So that's why we wanted to do a monitoring program. Okay, so caribou is important because part of our cultural keystone species in the community of our traditional area, and that and we wanted to. It's under our treaty right to harvest what we want to consume, or what we want it to be part of our way of life. And some of the members are still hunting, but sometimes they don't tell anyone, because as I know at one point I remember a gentleman was saying that they see caribou, but they don't want to report it because they always said M&R or someone or the company said, if you see caribou, please report it. But then they said, if you report it, then everything stalls. So that's what they didn't want to do, eh? So they just see it, they let it go by, and they continue. So I'm not sure if that's correct, but I don't know. But that's how some of our members feel, but not everyone goes out. But I know our main hunting that the community does now is the moose, because it's there, not too often, but they say when we see caribou, it's mostly on the main river system of Fort Albany, going up towards that area of our traditional background. So this is how we do our data. We have a focus group. We have elders come in, and we have the community, and there's either myself or usually I'll get Charlene in the back there. Please stand up, Charlene. She's the one that sometimes inputs our data, so I kind of rely on her to input some of my data, like the GIS. So I kind of really like to rely on her. She's very knowledgeable of what she does. So we always have to verify our data. So every time we do a plot, we make sure that we know who said it and exactly when, or at least give us a rough idea of where the sighting had happened. So we want to do that, and we're also seeking funding again. So we'll see what happens in the future if we get any more money. Okay, so this is what Carolyn was talking about, the collaring of the. I know this information is available on online. This is the collaring of the. What do you call it? Caribou. I guess they wander all over the place, so they don't go stay in one place. I like what's his name? There's a comment, Wilford. He's such a wonderful man. He says you can't tell a caribou to stay here. He's not going to listen to you. Like he's okay. Never mind. Okay, go ahead.
Where are you over there? Down, like in this blue.
I was gonna point over there.
Yeah. Oh, even down. Yeah, down here somewhere. I think it's straight across.
Okay. Okay, so this is our area of, okay, so you'll notice on the dark blue area within where that little notch is. I wish I had a little,
Your laser pointer?
yeah, right there, that's our core area. That's our land use planning. That's what we've,
Here too?
that's the far north boundary.
Okay.
So that within that, that's just the bottom. Anything below it is already planned for. So we have to plan past the far north boundary.
So
with
basically here down.
it's already is. Yeah. So that area in there, that's our core area of our land use planning. So the one on the outskirts there, on the green one, that's our shared area with our neighboring nations like Martin Falls, Kashashuan, Fort Albany, Moose Cree. Those communities, we still have shared meetings with them. But I know you'll notice a little notch on there, on the little notch there, Lindsay, on the bottom there. No, on top there. Yeah, right there, the little notch. That's Martin Falls. We've already met with them. So I just wanted to show you our area of interest within our land use plan. Okay, next one.
What's this one, Bertha?
That's our old community, Mamatawa. That's where the community first resided before moving to Pagua and before moving to where we presently are today is Constance Lake. So we still have ownership of Mamatawa. So that's still part of our lands, our community reserve, I guess, or however we want to say. Okay, so we did our study. Is it the next map, our study, Lindsay? Okay, so here is the study. Maybe Carolyn, you can elaborate more on what you've done. Yeah?
I'll just stand beside you then. This
Okay.
mic will catch me. That should work if I'm standing here for your mic. So, as Bertha mentioned, when we did the interviews, and please, this map is actually not for public consumption. We have buffered the site, so these caribou icons have been moved, so that we're not telling you exactly where they were hunted or anything like that. But where you see the little animals is where historically the caribou were harvested. So this gives us information about over time where they've been seen and harvested. And they're clustering so much along the river that it's just a black blotch. But you can see the place where most people went. In the spring, they went off the river. It's a really important area. Basically, where those animals are down in the south, so south of the blue line, it's pretty much nuked. But there is still quite a bit of habitat and not as much disturbance north of the blue line. So you'll see in the next slide, but the big blob is an area that's been identified as important habitat. So it's where they say, well, this is where they live. This is mostly marshland that's really important to the caribou. So we've broken the data out. If you go to the next slide, so we've broken it out into the big blob, which is what we've been told. The purple blob is what we've been told or is known to be core area. The orange cross-hatching are actually places where they've been seen or observed. So those are what we're calling observed core. So this is the summary of the data. Important core that we know people have either harvested or seen caribou, and purple where they've been known to be historically, but we don't have information about it right now.
So there aren't any people, like I used to live in what's now Wabakimi Park. We had a drop line there, and where we built our cabin. Every single spring, the herd would come, just as the snow was off the ice was still solid, the herd would come right there, hang out in front of the cabin, they didn't go anywhere, and then they went off and camped on the islands.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a pretty good sized, herd. And, they always came to the same place for the 4 years we were here, and I'm sure there's all kinds of places like that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that's interesting. When you get down into the data, you do find out where they go between seasons and where they go to calve. So you can get more detailed information. This is quite a big area.
Yeah,
It's quite generalized. But there is specific information about herds in it.
Oh,
Okay, so I'm gonna get Carolyn to finish to finish it off because she went on the after she did the interviews. She asked us if there was any signs anywhere. We told her, yeah, there is. So I kind of told her, you need to go here, here, and here. So this she'll explain to you.
So aside from doing all the field work where we talked about caribou and went to learn about where they were going, I also wanted to find out, well, what's the government doing? What's the province doing? So from the map that Bertha showed earlier, where she said there's unplanned areas north of that far north line. These are areas near the community where there used to be caribou, and it's logged. There's transmission lines. There's a lot of linear disturbance. There's a lot of features on the land. So people in the community, the elders were saying they moved north because of the development. There's no place for them left in the south. Next slide. So the province is monitoring. This is actually right in front of that cut block. It's kind of a funny place to put it, but anyway, there's a sign that says, if you see caribou, call us. And if you look closely at the sign, go to the next slide, you'll see that it says, if you shoot one that you see, you can be fined up to $25,000 or a year in prison. Doesn't differentiate Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal hunters. So you can see why seeing or hunting caribou could be underreported. It's a hefty fine to practice your rights. So go to the next one. So what are we doing with the results of this study? This is probably better if Bertha can tell you about it. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. We're kind of in the early stages. This is our first year of funding.
Okay, so what we're hoping this information would help us with some of the would help us with our land use planning. So that's why this was one of the avenues that we wanted to explore, was the species at risk part, because that's one of the objectives in our land use plan, was the species at risk. So that's why we kind of focused on the caribou. I mean, we could do some other ones, but we wanted to kind of focus more on the caribou baseline study. And also, it's to I guess the next we wanted to seek funding, other funding, and plan the caribou for our children in the future. And that's it.
And if you go back to that map that Bertha showed, where you can envision the data points that went up that river. Back here? Yeah, here. If we get the funding, it makes a lot of sense to go out, because as you were saying, in the spring, there's a lot of migration in the spring, and there's a lot of animals moving in that area in the spring. And every year, people used to go from down here up to their trap lines. So every spring they went up there. And so it would make a lot of sense to have a monitoring program that the community runs, where you get out and you go up the river and stop and check sites out all the way along the way. So if we can get funding for it, we would like to try to start a monitoring program.
Yep. That's it. Thank you.